Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guests today are Loryn and Dave Stone. Welcome to Comic Culture.
Hi, thanks.
Hey, thanks for having us.
So you are, I guess, a power couple. Loryn, you are the, I guess, the founder of poplurker.com, which is sort of a nerd culture website. And Dave, you are a director for Teen Titans Go.
Yes.
So, Loryn, I'll start with you. We were talking a little bit before the show that you were the only person brave enough to put the word lurker in the name of your business. So can you tell us about Pop Lurker and what you do?
Sure. Well, Pop Lurker came about the beginning of this year, 2018, because I had been writing for other internet publications, crack.com, and a few other smaller blogs. And it was coming down to the point where I had this really great string of luck, and then all of a sudden the sort of content they wanted shifted, and I just wasn't able to deliver any successful pitches that they wanted to have written into full articles. But I knew that there was too much just running through my head, and that I needed to get these articles out. So I sort of had a blog for a little while that was in a typical blog form. It was like lorynstone.wordpress, but the more I wrote these articles, the more I was like, this is content that's comparable to anything else that's on the internet. This looks like it could be a Nerdist countdown, a cracked article. It looks like it could be something from Gawker. So I made the decision to buy a domain and start asking other writers who may have never been published before to start contributing to my site. And I brainstormed for 24 hours. I knew I wanted a name that literally popped, but I didn't know I wanted pop in the title. So I had maybe like 3 or 4 other names that I considered, but then when I thought of the word lurker and I said Pop Lurker out loud a few times, it really stuck for me. And now I wear the word lurker like a badge of honor. I have a hat that says lurker. All of my writers are called lurkers. So it's just this kind of fun thing that we all embrace.
And the content that you have on there is, I guess it's more of the sci-fi, the comics, and that sort of entertainment area. So I'm wondering what it is about that genre that you are drawn to, and what is it about writing about that you're drawn to?
The fun thing about writing about pop culture is that it's so subjective. So it's not factual news. There's not a black or white. With writing about pop culture, you can go to nostalgia, and how you remember something completely varies from how someone else remembers something. So you can do a listicle, let's just say Power Rangers. You can write 10 listicles about Power Rangers, the best of, the worst of, the top something, and it's completely different from the person next to you. So it's this really interesting sort of journalism that, as long as your voice and opinions are different from the person next to you, and the reader can connect, then it makes it really special to kind of zero into this nerd culture, pop culture, and talk about movies, and talk about cartoons, and talk about things from childhood, or talk about things from today. You can wear those goggles from the past, or you can just talk about it as is. And there's just so much variety. And who doesn't like talking about their hobbies? Like, I'm a toy collector. I want to talk about fun things.
And what was it the one thing that really got you into fandom as a child growing up? That, you know, for me it was the daily newspaper, reading the comics in there. That's what got me into comics, and then from there superheroes and so on. So what was it that hooked you so that you decided that, you know, years later this is going to be your career?
It was definitely a combination of Power Rangers when I was about 9, 10 years old. And I just loved the giant robots. And then later I segued into Sailor Moon. And I was really into that fandom. That was my gateway drug that got me into other animes. From there, I've written articles all about it, about how I saw Sailor Moon, and then I said, oh, there's more anime out there. I wonder what else I can find. And this was around 1998. So the internet was in its infancy, but it was just good enough that I could start like looking on these web rings, and it was really this spiral, this rabbit hole. And then you'd go to video rental stores and you'd rent things that like were maybe pornographic and maybe weren't. So that was early anime collecting. And so from there, I've always had the collection bug. So from there, I started watching more anime, and so it was Sailor Moon and it was Power Rangers, and now as an adult, those are still my 2 main fandoms, but I've also added Mystery Science Theater 3000. So best fandom in the world.
You know, I've got to say, I go back to the Joel days on MST3K, so I'm looking forward to this Thanksgiving to watch some on Netflix.
Yes, yes, the gauntlet is coming.
And Dave, you are a director in animation, so I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that is, because I know what a film director does, but what does a director do in animation?
It kind of varies a little bit from show to show or production to production, as they're all handled a little bit differently. But generally, most of the time, the director kind of oversees a lot of the story aspects. So, in mostly the visual storytelling. So the storyboards, essentially, is the biggest thing that most directors deal with. There's also kind of like broad scope directors where it's like, oh, a film director, for example, would have his hands on everything. I mean, everything. But then, in television where I work, it tends to be a little more contained. Like on Teen Titans Go, I deal with the storyboards, the editing of the animatics, the sound design, as well as animation itself, keyframes when that comes back in from overseas. Not really overseas, it's Canada, but we call it overseas. But north of the border, and it comes back from the north. So yeah, that'll come in and I'll kind of check their work and correct the layouts and things like that. So you kind of, on that show, that's a little more hands-on than a lot of shows. A lot of shows a little more buttoned down, a little more, oh, you are the storyboard director. You'll hear storyboard supervisor a lot of times thrown around as a title, but sometimes that person will be called a director or a storyboard director. There's animation directors who direct literally just the animation. So like, the actual like cleanup and the movement and all that sort of stuff. So it can get a little more compartmentalized because, animation is such a big process and such a machine that you essentially, depending on the show, the needs of the director are different. And you have sometimes a really big reach or sometimes more narrow.
It's interesting. Teen Titans Go is one of those shows that everyone loves. The film had just come out. So I'm just wondering how you work your way up from doing the storyboards and get more responsibility to the point where you're, directing episodes
Sure.
of what has to be one of the, the hottest shows out there.
It's interesting. On season 1, when we started that show, I remember meeting with Aaron Horvath. He's one of the head writers, the EP on the show now. He runs the show, basically. He's run the show since the beginning, him and this other guy, Michael Jelinek. They're the kind of the two top dogs on there. They're also the writers. They oversee all the story and stuff like that. So I remember meeting with Aaron, and it was like, hey, do you know anything about Teen Titans? I was like, you mean the Cartoon Network show? From, he was referring to the 2003 version. I remember being like, I've seen a few, but I didn't know too much. I'm like, I know the characters, and I know I know as much as any other, nerd knows about, Robin and Cyborg and stuff, Yeah, I don't know much. He's like, that's perfect. Because we're doing comedy, and I don't want to be restrained by the stuff that basically came before it. So we wanted to reimagine everything. That's part of the reason why it's so different in a way, but still kind of the same. We're kind of using the characters as like basics, kind of like a mold, and then we're kind of stretching them out. Anyhow, when I started on that in season 1, it was sort of finding its footing, and I was doing storyboards then. And there was a lot of us from season 1 ended up leaving the show. And it wasn't that we didn't like the show, but it's that everybody was so talented, not to, toot my own horn or whatever. But a lot of guys left and went and directed other shows. And then people started coming back in to direct on Titans later. That's what I did. I ended up going to Nickelodeon to work on a show called Breadwinners and direct there. So essentially, that was actually my first directing job, official directing job. But it was kind of like because I knew the show and my sensibilities were there during season 1, a lot of the guys who were there, our sensibilities went into making what it became. So like our humor sort of bled into it so much, our visual stylings, all these things, they sort of stuck, and it became the mold of like, what is Teen Titans Go? So later on, when I was leaving Nickelodeon and they were looking for somebody to come in, it was very easy for me to just slip right in there, because it was like, oh, Dave already knows the show. He knows what makes it work. He knows what makes it tick. So it's like pretty easy for me to jump in, because it definitely takes a very specific mindset to do that show. It's a very specific sense of humor.
And it's interesting too because it's an example of if you are a fan of the comics, the George Perez, Marv Wolfman run in the 80s. It was a teen drama sort of like their version of the X-Men, but not very funny. I mean, you had Changeling, who was kind of a goofer,
so serious.
But yeah, crying every other issue. So when you're doing this and you're taking those characters, it's interesting to see how you can reimagine the same concept in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it too comes from, I think, from the guys working, like everybody works in the show, artists, especially comedy, storyboard guys, like everybody sort of tends to be, I don't know, just kind of a snarky ball buster. I don't know, like everybody's like a little ridiculous, and everybody likes to kind of poke fun at each other and stuff like that. So like by extension, I don't know, like the characters, the way they interact, I mean, it's ludicrous. It's definitely over the top. But like at the core of it, it's not that different from how like real friends treat each other and act the way they, interact and stuff like that, especially teenagers, especially like high school kids. They kind of tend to act a lot like that, or at least our generation did. I mean, I don't know, I think that the kids are a lot nicer now than we were. They're a lot nicer. We were all jerks. We were jerks.
We were so mean.
Lovingly though, that being said, but it's an exaggeration of that stuff, so it's yeah, then real world like ideas and grown up ideas bleed into it too, where like everyone always talks about that episode where they learn about mortgages and how all that stuff works, and that's just like crazy, real life stuff bleeding down into people who are growing up and try to get their life together, but also make a cartoon, and they're like, what are we gonna write about? I don't know how to deal with these mortgages lately. And then it ends up in a show, It all comes from real life.
Loryn, I just wanted to jump over to you now and ask, because it seems like Dave is working in sort of that bullpen where there's a lot of folks working collaboratively on a show. It seems like you can run this website from home and email writers and get the content and post it. So I'm wondering how you are staying in touch with the folks that are lurkers on your site and adding content for you.
Everybody who contributes now to Pop Lurker has become a friend. These are people that not only do they trust me to publish their work, but they also allow me to edit it. They allow me to have opinions. I give writer feedback all the time. My phone is blowing up from 6:30 a.m. to 11 p.m. because time zones are irrelevant, and I have writers, with me from all over the world, typically US, Canada, and the UK, but I have people everywhere who, come to me, who trust me to give them writing advice. I have people who go to conventions and do little write-ups. We try, like I was saying before, we try to keep it evergreen. So we'll do a few comic book reviews, we'll do manga reviews, we'll do movie reviews, but we really try to keep it not on entertainment news. And that's sort of a detriment because entertainment news is fast and that gets a lot of clicks and a lot of traffic, and it's a very good thing, but it's just not the content that any of us want to write. We tried it and it just doesn't work for us. So yes, I can do it from home. I get emails from my people, and we just joke around and have a great time. So we used to have a Discord chat, and yeah, we're just a bunch of happy-go-lucky nerds just being loud and rowdy at our cafeteria table. So
you mentioned some of the articles that you put on there, you try to avoid the pop culture. And I recall one was about movie soundtracks and how they worked with the film. And that's really interesting stuff. And I'm wondering, when you're not doing stuff that you can sort of review on your own and come up with your own thesis, let's say you wanted to do an interview with someone, how are you going and making those connections, or how are you helping your writers make those connections so that they can go ahead and maybe do a retrospective of something that came out 20 years ago?
Well, in regard to the interviews, that's just me being bold and just throwing myself out there and not taking no for an answer. Like, I'm not afraid. I will throw myself in front of that bus and say, wait, I want to interview the driver. Okay, now you can run me over. But yeah, and it goes back to, I make connections at conventions. a lot of, every website's convention coverage differs. Some people focus really hard on cosplay, and if that's the MO for your website, that's fine. For mine, I like to talk to vendors, toy designers, comic book artists. So that's where I make a lot of connections. I interview people at conventions. If it's a band that I really like, or a band that for example, I interviewed a couple members of this band called Power Glove. Not only are they a great metal band, but they play music from video games. So you kind of have this crossover. So that's fascinating to me. I've interviewed now two actresses from Mystery Science Theater, Rebecca Hansen, who currently plays the voice of Gypsy, and she is Cynthia Pearl Forrester's clone. That interview is live on Pop Lurker now. But I also got to interview Mary Jo Pell, who played the original Pearl Forrester, and she's my hero. She's one of my teenage heroes, and I talked to her like we were just people for 45 minutes. And I only choked up once because it was just amazing to. I'm just so fortunate and happy that I'm in that position now, that I've built this for myself, that I have this reputation of being someone who conducts interviews. People come to me as well now. I don't just reach out. I have agencies coming to me asking me to interview their musicians and their actors, and it's humbling and it's amazing, and I hope that I continue to carve that out in this industry and build that reputation.
It's got to be another balancing act, because you want really good content, but at the same time you need to monetize this, because you need to pay bills, you need to, as Dave was saying, you got to worry about that mortgage. So without getting into specifics about dollars, but how do you go ahead and try and make money off of something that's a project of personal importance?
There's a couple different ways. Right now I have what's called a Ko-fi or a Ko-fi account. So those are small instant donations where people can give you small amounts of money, increments of $3. And it's like, hey, buy me a coffee, and they kick you down a few dollars, which I definitely appreciate. Another option is a Patreon. And I did have a Patreon for Pop Lurker. I did take a couple month hiatus from it, where I was editor-in-chief for nerdbot.com. Ultimately, great website, wonderful people. I wasn't enjoying the content. I needed to go home. So, but before that, I did have a Patreon account for Pop Lurker, which I used to pay my writers and pay for the domain. I didn't take a cent home. But so, there's options like that. Some sites are really good at merchandising. They can make pins and stickers and shirts, and people will actually buy them. I give those away for free. When I go to conventions and I hand out my business card, I give vendors and artists stickers and pins for free, because I just love what I'm doing. So there's a couple ways. And of course, if you get enough traffic on your site, you can have typical ads, but that's got to be somewhere upwards of the 100,000 clicks a week for that to make a difference. Otherwise, you're just annoying your readers, and nobody wants to be on a site with ads on it unless it really benefits the site. For Pop Lurker, I get great traffic. It does not benefit the site, so there are no ads on Pop Lurker.
Well, Dave, I'm going to turn to you and ask a question about storytelling, which is something in comics that's trying to convey a story in still images, but you're doing it in moving images. So I'm wondering, when you're putting together a storyboard or directing a storyboard, how are you sort of thinking about those visuals, and how do you get that idea from what you see on paper to what we see on the screen?
It's a little bit of trial and error, and it's a little bit of like, it's a little bit of like, you sort of build a repertoire after a while, where you sort of like, oh yeah, there's like sort of rhythms, like, oh well, wide, close, medium, wide, close, medium. Like you can kind of, it's funny, you won't really necessarily notice these sort of things, but they're happening all the time on television, especially with animated shows. I like working in 2D shows, comedy shows specifically, because the visuals tend to be a little more simple as far as like the staging and stuff like that goes. There's not a lot of fancy camera work. There's not a lot of dynamics. There can be, but it tends to be kind of simple. It's more focused on the humor, or the visually presenting something in a funny way. But typically, what I will do is sort of start with just thumbnailing stuff out, and that's the old art term thrown around. They call it thumbnails because they're supposed to be tiny drawings, like the size of a thumb. I guess that's why they're called that, I think. Anyhow, I use little tiny post-it notes, the littlest post-it notes that are like about an inch by an inch and a half or so. And just really quickly with like little just circles and sticks and very little simple drawings of the characters, kind of map out the basic form of how a scene's going to go, based on like, we have script on Titans, we have a script, but we also have a dialogue record, which is actually really nice. It kind of harkens back to like some of the old Looney Tunes stuff. They used to use a lot of actual records when they started buttoning stuff down. But having a record to work from is nice because I'll have the voice actors read, and it can inspire sort of like a moment that might not be there in the script, versus another show where you might have a script, but you have to decide how this line's going to get delivered. And that's a whole nother animal. It's really pretty complicated. I'm like realizing, I'm like, man, I could go on and on about this for got like an hour to kill, because we could talk about just this for a while. But yeah, I typically tend to build it up. I start really simple with simple thumbnails, kind of lay them out, see if feel like it's working, and then toss what doesn't work. Sort of iteration, slowly building up. It's like anything, like when you see somebody might be working on like a painting or something, they might start with just like a really quick drawing of what they want it to be, and then quickly lay out some block in some color, and then they start to flesh it out, and they end up that hillside needs to come down, and then it's just sort of constantly evolving it slowly. It's the same thing as like one drawing. It's just a series of drawings to tell a whole story.
And it's interesting because you say that I guess the voices are recorded before you start the animation, so you're able to play with the beats a little bit. So that gives you the advantage of, let's say, the old Popeye cartoons where it was clear that they were looking at the cartoon and voicing it.
We're lucky on that show because the actors have been doing the roles for so long that they really know the characters so well. And they're way on board with the crazy direction that the show's gone in, based, from the melodrama of the 03 series, but to now. So like, like Scott Medville, who does Robin, he's phenomenal. Like, that dude's really good voice actor, excellent. And he will take Robin and make him completely insane. Like, the voice just sounds so stressed and like agitated, and you can like feel all that tension just in the voice. And when you hear that, you're like, oh, Robin can't just be sitting there. Like, he needs to be like just shaking and like falling on the floor, like just losing his mind. Like, he's gonna run through the wall. Like, you can like almost hear the action in the voice. Like it calls for it in an interesting way. So it's kind of it's not 100% unique to that show. There's other shows that work like that, but it's definitely a cool thing. I think it's really fun. It lets you focus on just coming up with some funny visuals and really making the jokes sing and stuff.
And speaking of visuals, I thought it was an interesting point, and I think a lot of us don't think about it. We just sort of watch TV passively, but comedies always seem to have a very simple visual compared to the horror film or the sci-fi film. And I think it's something that we could sort of, when we're watching TV, sort of start to pay attention to and get a bit more out of it.
A lot of people talk about sitcom camera, if you go in and watch standard sitcom camera, it's like wide of the entire room. So you see the whole crew and everyone's sort of positioned, and then it cuts in on this guy. It's like in camera A, camera B, and then like the whole room, and that's it. And it's just a 3-camera system, and it just goes click, 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 and it goes between all three. It's sort of like a lot of it's staged like vaudeville, like a stage show. It's a set, you put the characters on it, and you just have them play it out in this small setting. And that tends to be comedy. It tends to be more intimate like that. Not always, but it tends to be.
And Loryn, I see we have about 3 minutes left. I wanted to ask you about poplurker.com and how you might be using social media to drive traffic to your site. So I'm wondering if you are doing that and what your strategies might be.
My strategies are being incessant. On for example, like Twitter is Twitter, and you just have to be clever with your hashtags and remember to retweet your articles and just try to build up a presence. Find a blend between what kind of humor will help me build my platform as a writer, but not get me in trouble if I should ever get a really good deal of some sort. Like now, like I have a book out, a young adult book, and should it pop and I build a really cool audience, I don't want them to go on it and be like, who's this scumbag who wrote it? Because sometimes I can get a little bit, just a little bit ridiculous. I say ridiculous things. All of my articles are a blend between, autism and pop culture, what it's like to be a parent with a kid on the spectrum, or here's some horror movie villains I'd like to have sex with. So that's the content of Pop Lurker. It's really also like on Facebook, you join groups, you make friends with the admins, you ask them if you're allowed to share your work, and it brings awareness to your website. It brings awareness to your brand. Pop Lurker is a combination between the website itself being what it is, because I do have those excellent writers contributing, but it's also me, Loryn Stone, the pop culture internet writer, who's trying to build my own platform and awareness. So that's the balance there. Just finding people who will support you, share your work, and it's opening yourself up too. You can't build a platform if your social media is private with your 40 family members. It's just not going to happen. It's really putting yourself out there, opening up those accounts, letting them know what your content is and what your voice is, and embracing it, and embracing just being an internet garbage person, because it makes us laugh. It's funny. You see you're laughing. It's funny.
It's hilarious.
And that's basically it.
Well, it's a great segue because we've run out of time. I'd like to thank both of you for spending some time with me today on comic culture. I'd like to thank you at home for watching, and we will see you again soon. Comic Culture is a production of the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.